My name is Agnes Cazares, 31 years old. 4 days after my daughter was born, my father held her for the first time. She opened her eyes, and her mouth lifted in what looked like a tiny smile. The first thing he said was not her name. "She has her grandmother's eyes," he whispered, about a woman who died before I was old enough to remember her face. I didn't correct him. I didn't cry. I just held my daughter a little tighter. Everyone in that room thought he was a grieving man being sweet about a baby. They didn't know what that sentence meant, or what he had already prepared. That was the night everything began to turn. To understand it, you have to go back 30 years to a house built around a woman I was raised to become. My father repaired antique clocks. That was his work, and it was also the truest thing about him. He spent his days bent over dead machines, cleaning their tiny hearts, teaching them to keep time again long after the people who bought them were gone. Our house sounded like a heartbeat that never belonged to anyone living, ticking in every room. He loved things that had stopped and could be made to move again. I understand that now. It took me most of my life. The house I grew up in belonged to a dead woman. Her name was Madeline. She was my mother, and she died after a sudden illness in 1998 when I was 4 years old. By the time I was old enough to ask what she had really been like, my father's version of her had already become dangerous to question. I have no memory of her face. Everything I knew about her came from a house that refused to let her leave. Her photographs were on every wall, not a few, every wall. The hallway was a gallery of a woman laughing at parties I would never attend, standing on beaches that had probably eroded, holding a baby that was me, but felt like a prop in someone else's shrine. Her coat still hung by the door when I was small. Her handwriting was still on the grocery list, stuck to the refrigerator, yellowed, curling, and my father would not let anyone take it down. There was an answering machine in the kitchen, an old one, and it still had her voice on the outgoing message. "You've reached the Ashfords. Leave it after the beep." My father never changed it. For years, strangers, calling about clock repairs, heard a dead woman greet them, warm and casual, as if she'd just stepped out. I thought all of this was love. When you are a child, you have no other word for it. What I learned slowly, the way you learn the temperature of water you're already sitting in, was that my father's warmth had a price, and the price was her. When I wore my hair long and loose, the way hers fell in the photographs, he would look at me across the dinner table and go soft, almost tearful, and rest his hand over mine. When I asked to cut it, the softness left the room. I was 7 the first time I understood the trade. He gave me a locket that year, gold, oval, with her picture pressed inside it. He fastened it around my neck himself, and his hands were shaking, and he said, "So, you never forget whose face you carry." I remember thinking it was the kindest thing anyone had ever done for me. I wore it every day for 11 years. It never once occurred to me to wonder why a 7-year-old needed to be reminded of whose face she carried, instead of simply being told she had a face of her own. I want to be precise about this, because it is the kind of thing people don't believe unless you show them the small pieces. My father was not a man who screamed. He never raised a hand. If you had met him, you would have liked him. You would have said, "That poor man, he loved his wife so much he never remarried. Look how he keeps her memory alive. Isn't that beautiful?" That was the version everyone got. That was the version I believed too, for 27 years. The cruelty didn't look like cruelty. It looked like devotion. That was what made it survive so long. When I was 12, I asked to cut my hair to my shoulders. A small thing, a 12-year-old wanting to look like the other 12-year-olds. He didn't forbid it. That was never his method. He simply went quiet. For 9 days he barely spoke to me, passing me in the ticking hallways like I was a piece of furniture that had been moved to the wrong place. He didn't punish me. He withdrew and let the absence do the work. On the 9th day, I told him I'd changed my mind and would grow it back. The warmth returned like a furnace. He hugged me and said, "There's my girl." I was so relieved I cried. It took me almost 20 years to understand what I had learned that week. Be her, and you are loved. Be yourself, and you will be left in the cold until you correct the mistake. By 16, I had stopped making the mistake. For my 16th birthday, he gave me a dress. It was hers. Deep green, slightly out of style, carefully preserved in a garment bag at the back of his closet for 12 years. He asked me to wear it to a family dinner. I did. When I came down the stairs, he stood up from his chair, and his eyes filled, and for a long moment he didn't say anything at all. Then he said, very quietly, "For a second there, you were her." He meant it as the greatest gift he could give me. I understood, standing on those stairs in a dead woman's dress, that the compliment was not for me. It sailed straight past me to someone who wasn't there. I smiled and said thank you. I had learned to smile and say thank you. But something in me went very still that night, and it never fully moved again. I was 17 when I finally asked him the question directly. We were in his workshop. He was leaning over the open back of a mantel clock, tweezers in hand, and I stood in the doorway and I said, "Dad, do you ever look at me and see me? Or do you only ever see her?" He set down the tweezers. He didn't get angry. I almost wish he had. Instead, his face crumpled, wounded, as if I had reached into his chest, and he said, "How could you say something so cruel about your mother?" And that was the whole trick, right there in one sentence. I had asked to be seen, and he had turned it into an attack on the dead. The wound was mine, but somehow I was the one who had drawn blood. I apologized. I actually apologized. And I stopped asking. That is where I have to leave the beginning, because the beginning could go on forever, and the beginning is not the point. The point is what I did next, and what he did when he found something new to pour her into. The night before I left for nursing school in 2012, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and unclasped the locket. I had worn it for 11 years. My neck felt strange without it, light and cold, like the skin had been covered so long it had forgotten the air. I walked into the living room, where he was reading under a lamp surrounded by the ticking of 100 clocks, and I set the locket on the table beside him. I didn't make a speech. I said, "I'm keeping my own face now." He looked at it lying there on the table, and then he looked at me, and for the first time in my life I saw something in his expression I couldn't name. It wasn't sadness. It was closer to fear, as if I had taken something from him. I picked up my bag and left the next morning. When I asked whether he would help with tuition or books, he refused, saying nursing had nothing to do with the life Madeline had lived. I want to tell you, it felt like freedom. It didn't. It felt like falling. I was 18, and I had almost nothing. I want you to understand how thin the margin was, because later, when people heard my father tell his version, they always assumed I'd been given the world and thrown it back in his face. The truth is, I left with 2 suitcases and a checking account that I watched drop below $40 more than once. I took the overnight shifts nobody wanted because they paid a few dollars more an hour. I lived in a studio apartment where the radiator only worked if you hit it, and I hit it every winter night for 3 years. I learned to make a pot of rice last 4 days. I learned that being alone is a physical thing, a weight in the chest, not just an idea. And in the middle of all of that, during my first winter away, my Aunt Roz came back into my life. Rosalind Merrick was my mother's younger sister, and for most of my childhood, she had been a name that made my father's mouth tighten. He kept her at a distance, and I never understood why. only that visits were rare, closely watched, and cut short, and that after she left, he would spend the evening straightening the photographs on the walls as if she had knocked them crooked just by being there. Roz drove 4 hours to my apartment, carrying a slow cooker and a bag of groceries, sat on my terrible couch, and said the thing that started to unlock everything. She said, "You know your mother would have hated all this, don't you?" I didn't understand. I said, "Hated what?" "Being turned into a saint," Roz said. "Madeline, my sister. She was not a quiet, gentle angel who floated through the world. She had a temper. She argued with everyone, especially your father. She laughed so loud in restaurants that people turned around. She dyed her hair red once out of pure spite, and he didn't speak to her for a week. She wanted to leave that town so badly she used to cry about it." Roz looked around my freezing little apartment, and she almost smiled. "You want to know who you actually take after? It's not the woman in those pictures. It's the woman she really was. And that woman would have been proud of you for getting out." I sat there, and I could not speak. My whole life, my mother had been a photograph, a dress, a locket, a road I was supposed to walk. And here was someone telling me she had been a person, that she had wanted to escape the same house I had just escaped. It was the first time I understood that my father hadn't been keeping my mother alive at all. He had been keeping a version of her, one he built, one that never argued, never left, never wanted anything he didn't want for her. The real Madeline had been erased twice, first by the illness that took her when I was 4, and then by the obedient statue my father built in her place. If you have ever been loved for a version of yourself that someone else invented and left in the cold every time the real you showed through, then you already know the specific silence of that apartment. You don't have to explain it to anyone. You already carry it. I didn't have the language for any of it yet. I just knew that something Roz said had cracked a window in a room I'd been sealed inside my whole life. I finished nursing school in 2016 and earned my RN license. It took everything I had. I then entered a competitive new graduate residency in the neonatal intensive care unit, the NICU. I spent my days with the smallest, newest, most fragile humans on Earth, babies born too soon who weighed less than a bag of sugar and fought for every breath. I remember one girl in particular, born at 26 weeks, so small my wedding ring could almost have circled her wrist. For weeks it was touch and go. Her mother sat by the incubator and whispered to her for hours, and one night she looked up at me, exhausted, terrified, and asked, "After all this, is she still going to be herself?" And I told her the truth. I said, "She already is herself. She's the one deciding to stay." That's what the unit teaches you, if you let it. A person arrives already whole. You don't hand them a self. You just try to keep them alive long enough for them to show it to you. And here is the thing about that work, the thing that mattered later. In the NICU, you learn to see each baby as entirely, completely their own person. 2 pounds and already a whole individual, with a temperament, a fight, a self. In that unit, resemblance never mattered more than the person fighting inside the incubator. You learn to see the only version of that child who would ever exist. I spent my 20s learning to see people as themselves. My father had spent his life doing the opposite. I did not recognize the symmetry then. I do now. There was a milestone in 2016 I have to tell you about, because it is the clearest photograph I have of the whole thing. At the end of my program, there was a pinning ceremony, the ritual where a nursing pin is fastened to your uniform before you recite the oath. It mattered to me more than I let anyone see. I had built this out of nothing, with my own hands, entirely off the road he associated with Madeline. I invited my father. To my surprise, he came. He sat in the back, and afterward he found me in the crowd, and for one breath I let myself hope. He looked at me in my white uniform. His eyes went soft and distant, and he said, "You look just like she did at your age." Not one word about the work, the years, the debt, or the shifts. He had looked at the life I had made without her and found another door back to her inside it. I said thank you because I had learned to say thank you. But I drove home understanding something final. No achievement could force him to see me if he remained determined to look through me. The NICU residency was competitive, and I had no certainty I would be accepted as a new graduate. When the offer came, I read the email in my freezing apartment, hit the radiator out of habit, and then laughed alone for the first time in months. The place was mine. No one had walked that road ahead of me and left footprints to follow. I had earned it myself. Those years were not a straight climb. I want to be honest about the falls, because the falls are where you find out who someone is. There was a night in 2018, during my second year in the NICU, when we lost a baby during a bad shift. I came home hollowed out and did something I hadn't done in a long time. I called my father. I don't know what I wanted. Comfort, maybe. To hear a voice that had known me since before I could speak. He answered, and I told him it had been a hard night, that I'd lost a patient, and there was a pause, and he said, "Well, you chose that world," and that was all. No warmth, no question about how I was. I had walked off the road he associated with Madeline, so even my grief seemed unreal to him. I said goodnight. I set the phone down on the counter and stood in my dark kitchen understanding, all the way down, that there was no one behind me. If I fell, I would land alone. So I decided to stop falling. I met Daniel in 2018, 2 years after finishing nursing school, and I almost did not let it happen because I did not know how to be seen. On our third or fourth date, he asked my favorite color. It was a small, ordinary question, and I opened my mouth to answer before realizing I did not know. No one had ever asked me. My life had been organized around someone else's favorites, music and road. I said, "I don't know." Instead of laughing, he said, "Okay, then let's find out." Over the next months, he kept asking what I liked, wanted, and thought. He was not looking for my mother in my face. He was looking at me and finding me interesting. I had reached my mid-20s without knowing a person could be loved that way. We married in the spring of 2021, when I was 27. It was small. Roz was there, and my father came. At the reception, he pulled me aside and said, "You're taking his name." I said, "Yes. Cazares." I was becoming Agnes Cazares. My father looked stricken. "You're erasing her name," he said quietly. Madeline had taken Ashford when she married him, and he had spent my life treating that shared surname as another place where she continued. As if my name had never belonged to me. Changing it meant pouring her out of the container he had made. On my wedding day, my father mourned again, not for the daughter getting married, but for the version of his wife he believed my name preserved. I let it go. I had become skilled at letting things go. Daniel and I built an actual life that belonged to us. In 2024, we bought a small house with a crooked front step and too much yard. I remember standing in the empty living room on the first night and hearing ordinary silence, not the ticking silence of my father's house, but my own. I thought, this is what it feels like to live somewhere that is not a memorial. Early in 2025, I found out I was pregnant. We were overjoyed. When I told my father by phone, there was a long silence before he said the thing that should have warned me. He did not ask when I was due or whether we knew the sex. He said, "Maybe she'll have Madeline's eyes." He had already imagined a girl and decided whose features she should carry. I told myself he was an older man softened by the news, reaching for the person he had lost. Months later, after Daniel and I learned we were having a daughter but kept her name private, Warren began making plans of his own. I would not understand their extent until after she was born. Violetta was born in October 2025, a little earlier than expected. She spent 3 days under observation in the NICU, in the same kind of unit where I had spent my career, except this time I was not the nurse. I was the mother on the other side of the incubator, watching the monitor, and finally understanding what my patient's parents had felt. She was stable. I need you to know that, because it was the only easy part of this story. By the 4th day, she was pink, furious, strong, and completely herself, and the doctors discharged us together, except we did not go to our own home. I had delivered by cesarean, and recovery was harder than I expected. My father insisted that Daniel, Violetta, and I stay at his house for several days so I could rest while he helped with meals and the practical things I could not yet manage. Daniel was hesitant. I was the one who agreed, and I want to be honest about that. Some 7-year-old part of me, the part that still wore the locket in her mind, thought this might finally crack him open. Maybe holding his granddaughter would teach him to look at her as herself and, through that, finally look at me. That hope was the most expensive thing I had ever owned. He had prepared a room for us. When he opened the door, I felt the first cold line of understanding move down my spine, though I could not yet name it. The crib was new and beautiful, but the room around it was a museum. A framed photograph of Madeline, where a picture of the baby should have been, her old jewelry box on the dresser, and several objects from the house I had grown up in. Above the crib, in careful painted letters, was one name: Madeline. He had painted it after learning the baby was a girl, before Daniel and I had told anyone her name. I stood there, holding my 4-day-old daughter, exhausted from surgery, 3 nights of hospital sleep, and the drive from discharge, and told myself he was only overexcited. We had already brought our bags inside, and I did not have the strength to fight that moment. I put Violetta in the crib and did not sleep. That same afternoon, after we had arrived from the hospital and settled our bags, the family came to meet her. Daniel's parents drove up, along with a few cousins and Roz. Everyone crowded into my father's living room beneath the photographs and ticking clocks, carrying the beautiful, breathless energy that follows a new baby from one pair of arms to another. Then it was my father's turn. He took her carefully, trembling a little. The whole room went quiet and warm, waiting for the sweet thing the grieving grandfather would surely say. Violetta opened her eyes and looked toward his face. Her mouth moved in something close to a newborn reflex smile, and the room made that soft, collective sound people make when they think they have witnessed recognition. And my father looked down at my daughter, and his eyes filled, and he whispered, "She has her grandmother's eyes. Not her name. Not hello. Not she's beautiful." He looked at the newest person in the room and saw a door back to Madeline. It was the same door he had spent 27 years trying to force open through me, and now he was looking at my daughter with the same hunger. In that second, the window Roz had cracked years earlier blew wide, and I saw the pattern of my life at once. Whatever love my father felt for me had always been filtered through a ghost. He had repeatedly valued the resemblance he could preserve over the person standing in front of him, and now he was reaching for my child to continue it. I did not scream. I did not cry. Everyone in that room thought they were watching a tender moment. I walked over and I gently took my daughter back, and I held her against my chest, and I smiled the smile I had learned when I was 16. And inside, something that had been asleep for 27 years stood up, That night, while the house ticked in the dark, I woke Daniel and told him we had to leave. I was still sore from surgery and moving slowly, so he packed our bags and secured Violetta in the car seat while I wrapped her in the plain blanket we had brought from home. I carried her down the hall, past the painted name and the photograph standing over her crib, and we walked out into the cold without waking my father. Daniel drove us back to the house with the crooked step. I sat beside our daughter for the entire drive and whispered, "I will not let him do to you what he did to me." I meant it more than I had ever meant anything. I thought that was the end of it. I believed Daniel and I could keep our distance, protect our daughter, and leave my father alone with his ghosts. I did not yet know what he had already set in motion before she was born. By leaving quietly in the night, we had also given him the simplest possible story to tell. The grieving grandfather abandoned in an empty room, and the cold daughter who had taken his grandchild away without explanation. The next morning, my father collapsed. That was the word that spread through the family before anyone called me. Roz called first because she had been there. Warren had become dizzy in the doorway of the empty nursery and sat down hard on the edge of the bed. He never lost consciousness. Paramedics checked him, found no immediate emergency, and did not take him to the hospital. By the time relatives began arriving, he was pale but upright and talking clearly. In fact, Roz said he was talking almost continuously about how his daughter had stolen his granddaughter during the night, how the shock of the empty crib had nearly stopped his heart, and how little time he might have left to know the baby. The dizziness may have been genuine. What followed was a deliberate enlargement of it into a family tragedy with me cast as its cause. I am a NICU nurse. I knew that dizziness and grief were not evidence that a heart was failing, but I also knew I had not examined him and could not diagnose what happened. I was not going to dismiss a real symptom simply because I distrusted the person describing it. What I could judge was the story he chose to tell afterward and the parts he left out. Within 2 days, that story had done its work. Cousins I had not spoken to in years called. So did a great-aunt and, gently, one of Daniel's relatives. The wording changed, but the message did not. He was an old widower. I had nearly broken his heart, and compassion required me to bring the baby back to the room I had fled. My great-aunt Prudence called on the 3rd day. She was 80, had known me since birth, and never raised her voice, which somehow made it worse. "Agnes," she said, "I changed your diapers, so I've earned the right to say this. Your father is in that house with a broken heart. You're holding the cure and keeping it from him out of spite. I never thought a child of Madeline's could be this cold." Again, a relative reached past me and used my dead mother as the standard I was failing to meet. I said, "The paramedics did not find an emergency. He was never unconscious. Roz watched the whole thing." After a silence, Prudence answered, "That's not the point." She was right in one unintended way. They did not want a medical fact or an explanation of the room. They wanted the simpler story of a grieving widower and a cruel daughter, because that story required nothing difficult from anyone except me. That was when I understood the trap. What my father had done to me for years was difficult to prove, because it left no bruise and rarely produced a public scene. It lived in withdrawn affection, borrowed clothes, inherited names, and the constant demand that I disappear politely. The family saw a devoted widower who had become dizzy with grief and a cold daughter who had removed his only grandchild during the night. If I tried to explain that he had looked at my baby and seen his dead wife, painted another name above her crib, and begun repeating the pattern, I would sound like the difficult daughter they already expected. He did not need to invent every accusation. He exaggerated one episode, omitted the room he had prepared, and let everyone complete the story for him. I came close to folding. When enough relatives tell you that you are cruel, the accusation begins to enter your own voice. Each time I wavered, I stood beside Violetta's crib in our house, looked at her sleeping as herself, and remembered the name painted above the other crib. I reminded myself that returning her would not heal my father. It would only teach him that enough public sorrow could reopen any boundary. By the middle of November, something Roz had mentioned kept turning in my mind. "You know he opened something at the bank," she had said. She had seen an account statement while helping him organize papers at his request. I asked what she meant, and then I asked my father directly in writing, so there could be no later argument about his answer. His response changed this from a sad story about grief into a documented plan aimed at my daughter. Warren answered by sending me a photograph of the statement, proud enough to believe it would prove his devotion. Weeks before Violetta's birth, he had opened an education investment account under his control and deposited $30,000, the same man who had refused to help with a nursing textbook. Across the statement, in the field where the bank allowed an account nickname, he had written Madeline Ashford Education Fund. He explained in the message beneath it that once he obtained the baby's identifying information, he intended to designate her as the beneficiary and pay for the future Madeline had never been given. The account did not legally rename my daughter, and he had no power to obtain her information without us, but it documented that before learning the name Daniel and I had chosen, he had already assigned her education, identity, and imagined future to a dead woman. Once I knew to ask, the remaining pieces came quickly. Roz had seen a tiny silver bracelet engraved Madeline and my mother's old cream christening blanket, with the same name newly stitched into one corner. Warren confirmed both when I confronted him and later displayed them himself. Roz also showed me messages he had sent her and other relatives after learning we were having a girl. For weeks he had stated that the baby's name was Madeline, not as a suggestion, family nickname, or private hope, but as a settled fact. Several relatives had believed him and begun using it among themselves. Daniel and I appeared in those messages only as people who had not yet accepted the decision Warren believed grief and seniority entitled him to make. This was more than spontaneous grief. Grief may explain why he wanted Madeline near him. It did not excuse opening an account, ordering engraved objects, painting her name above another child's crib, and announcing that name as fact. Those were separate decisions made over months, each requiring time, money, and another chance to stop. Together, they formed a documented plan to place Violetta inside the role he had once assigned to me, beginning before she could hold up her own head. The plan was protected by the family's belief that he was only a sweet widower missing his wife, and by his own certainty that preserving Madeline mattered more than recognizing the living child in front of him. I met Roz at her kitchen table and laid out the statement Warren had sent, his messages, and what she had witnessed about the bracelet and blanket. Seeing the pieces together removed the last possibility that the nursery had been one impulsive mistake. Then I finally said the sentence I had circled my whole life. He's not remembering her. He's replacing her. He did it to me, and now he's doing it to my daughter. Roz did not call me cruel or tell me to excuse him. She took my hand and said, "I saw pieces of it when you were a child, especially that locket, and I told myself grief explained them. I should have challenged him and stayed closer to you. I am sorry I did not. But you can stop the pattern now before she learns to disappear for him." That was the moment I stopped defending and started deciding. Here was my problem, and I understood it clearly. I could not win this in the shadows. If I simply refused to see him, if I fought him quietly, family by family, phone call by phone call, he would win, because his story was simple and mine sounded like paranoia. The abuse had remained invisible because it rarely looked like an attack. If I accused him of trying to replace my daughter, I would sound like the hysterical daughter attacking a grieving widower. But I no longer needed to diagnose his motives for the family. I needed to state Violetta's identity clearly and let Warren decide whether he could respect it. He did not believe the nursery, the account, or the engraved name were wrong. He had explained the same belief tenderly at dinner tables, on staircases, and into my newborn's face. A real family gathering would give him the chance to honor my daughter's name. If he chose instead to correct her parents and defend Madeline's claim on her, those words would be his, not an accusation I had manufactured. So I decided to hold a naming ceremony, not his christening for Madeline, a real ceremony for my daughter. Daniel and I would invite both families and Roz, use neutral ground, and introduce Violetta Cazares in front of the relatives Warren had already given another name. I would not accuse him, mislead him, or design a confrontation around the baby. The invitation and the ceremony would state one fact: she was Violetta. Warren could accept that fact, remain silent, or reject it in his own words. Whatever choice he made would finally be visible to the same family that had been judging mine. If you've made it this far, you already know how you'd feel standing where I was standing. I keep wondering what you would have done, quietly disappeared with your child and never looked back, or forced the truth into the light where it could never be unseen. I chose the light. I need you to understand that I wasn't sure it would work. I only knew that silence had protected him for 27 years, and I was done being the place my mother went to be visited. Daniel and I planned it at our kitchen table over 2 nights. He was the one who said it had to be on neutral ground, not my father's house, not ours, somewhere no one owned, so no one could control the room. He booked the hall behind his family's church. We wrote the guest list together, both sides, and when I hesitated over inviting my father's relatives, the very people who'd been calling to shame me, Daniel set down his pen. "Invite them," he said, "especially them. They're the ones who need to be in the room." He understood before I did that the goal was not to hide my father or manufacture a confession. It was to stop hiding Violetta's real name so Warren could remain comfortable. When I called to confirm that he had received the invitation, his voice changed. The cold disappeared, and the old warmth returned, the reward for becoming his good girl again. "Oh, Agnes," he said, "I'm so glad you've come around. I'm glad we're finally going to do this properly." Then he said, with quiet relief, "I can't wait to finally bring Madeline home." The invitation had named Violetta in large print, so I did not allow that meaning to stand unanswered. "The ceremony is for Violetta Cazares," I said. "That is her name, Dad. Nothing about Sunday changes it." He went silent long enough for me to hear a clock behind him. Then he answered in the patient tone I remembered from childhood. "We'll talk when the family is together." He had heard me. He simply believed that once everyone gathered, his version would become the proper one and I would fall back into place. He came at me one more time before the day, in person, because that was his way. Never a fight, always a reasonable request delivered so gently that refusing it made you the villain. He came to our house, and he sat in our living room that did not tick, and he made his case. He said the baby should carry her grandmother's name. He said it was the right thing, the family thing. He said, "You owe her this. You owe me this. I gave you everything of your mother's. This is how it continues." When I did not answer, he opened the bag he had carried in, proud and completely certain. He placed the silver bracelet engraved Madeline and the christening blanket with the same name on our coffee table. Beside them, he set my old locket, saying that it should pass to the baby when she was older. Then he showed me the messages he had sent relatives announcing Madeline's name. He was not ashamed of any of it. He had brought the plan into my home and displayed every piece himself, smiling because he believed the account, the heirlooms, and the name proved love rather than possession. That certainty was more frightening than anger would have been. I did not argue. I had learned that argument was a door he knew how to hold shut. I looked at the bracelet intended for my daughter's wrist and said, "The invitation says Violetta. I will see you at her ceremony." Warren gathered the bracelet and blanket when he left, but the old locket remained on our coffee table. Whether he forgot it or expected me to save it for Violetta, I did not ask. That night, I sat beside her crib with the locket closed in my hand and a new blanket, soft and plain and ours, folded nearby. She had my stubborn chin, Daniel's ears, and no one's eyes but her own. "You are going to be you," I told her. "Only you." The next day, Warren would attend a ceremony whose invitation had stated her real name. Whatever he chose to say there would belong to him. We held the ceremony at the end of November 2025 in the community hall behind Daniel's family's church. Neutral ground. Bright, plain, full of folding chairs, coffee, and a sheet cake marked, "Welcome, Violetta." About 30 relatives from both families came expecting a simple celebration for a baby who had spent her first days in the NICU. Roz sat near the front, watching me steadily. Daniel stood beside me with one hand on my back. Warren arrived in his best jacket, carrying the same bag, greeting relatives with the radiance of a man approaching the culmination of a private and holy project. The invitation, cake, and printed program all said, "Violetta Cazares." He walked into the room as though each use of that name were only an error he would soon correct. I let the room settle. I let people find their chairs, and then I stood up at the front, and Daniel handed me our daughter, and I felt the whole warm weight of her against me, and I began. I thanked everyone for coming. I said a few true things about how long we'd waited for her, how hard her first days had been, how strong she was. The room was soft and smiling. My father was beaming in the second row, hands folded, waiting. And then I said it clearly, so every person in that room would hear it and carry it out with them. "We'd like to introduce our daughter. Her name is Violetta Cazares." For a second, nothing. And then a rustle of confusion moved through my father's side of the room, because they had been told for weeks that the baby's name was something else. I saw my father's smile flicker, not fall. Flicker, like a clock skipping a second. He leaned toward the woman beside him, and I heard him say, low, "No, there's been a mix-up." He thought I'd made a mistake. He genuinely believed the name simply hadn't reached me yet, that any moment this would be corrected, and the ceremony would resume its proper course. One of Daniel's aunts, a kind woman who knew nothing about any of this, leaned over to look at Violetta in my arms and said warmly, "Oh, she's the picture of you, Agnes. Look at her. She's got your whole face." And my father could not let it stand. "No," he said, out loud, firm, correcting her the way you'd correct a child who'd gotten a fact wrong. The room turned toward him. "No, she doesn't. She has her grandmother's eyes." There it was, the same sentence from the hospital, but this time in a room full of witnesses, this time with the whole context standing behind it. I didn't say anything. I had promised myself I wouldn't rush it. I let the silence sit, the way he had taught me to, all those years, and I watched it start to work on the room. Before I could say anything else, one of Warren's relatives asked why several people had been told that the baby's name was Madeline. Warren stood without any invitation from me and opened his bag. He held up the silver bracelet and christening blanket almost proudly. "I prepared these for her," he said. An aunt near the front read the embroidery aloud, confused. Madeline. After her grandmother, Warren answered, with the warmth of a man certain he was explaining something beautiful. That is the name she should carry. Agnes has been resisting because she does not understand what this means to the family. He had brought the evidence, chosen the moment, and explained it himself. You could feel the room begin to tilt. His own relatives, the ones who'd been telling me to have compassion, went quiet. Daniel's family looked confused, then uneasy. Someone said carefully, "Warren, that's not the baby's name." Faced with a room that was not immediately agreeing, my father did what he had always done in private. He defended the ghost. He did not laugh off the embroidery or admit that he had overstepped. His voice settled into the patient, reasonable tone that had controlled me for 27 years as the room listened and waited for him. "You don't understand," he said. "Madeline did not get to finish her life. Agnes carried part of her, and now this child can carry her forward. That is how family continues." Someone asked whether he truly meant the baby should be called Madeline instead of the name her parents had chosen. "She was always meant to be Madeline," he answered. Then he looked at me. "You were how I kept your mother close. I thought you understood that." He did not summarize every private wound or announce that children existed as vessels. He said enough. He denied my daughter's name and admitted that he had treated mine as a way to preserve his wife. The room fell into an uneven silence. Not everyone understood the entire history at once. A few relatives still looked as though they wanted to reduce it to grief, confusion, or an awkward tribute that had gone too far. But others, the ones who had received his messages, seen the embroidered name, and now heard him describe my purpose, could no longer call the pattern harmless. Prudence lowered her eyes. Warren's sister stared at the bracelet. Daniel's family looked toward us instead of him. I had not proved every private wound in one exchange, and I did not need to. Warren had made the central pattern visible. Preserving Madeline mattered to him more than either living person's right to be named as herself. The words were in the room now. Some people would still excuse them, but no single family story could make everyone unhear them. I stood there holding my daughter, and I looked at my father, and for once I was not afraid of him, and I was not trying to earn anything from him, and I said the only thing I had to say. "Dad, you didn't lose Mom twice. You've just spent my whole life trying to bury me alive, and now you want to start digging a grave for her too." I looked down at Violetta, awake, unbothered, entirely her own small self. Her name is Violetta. She is nobody's second chance, and neither was I. He opened his mouth. Nothing came. For the first time in my life, my father had no gentle, reasonable sentence to reach for. I wrapped my daughter tighter in the new blanket, the plain one, ours, and I walked down the center of that silent room. And I did not walk toward him. I walked toward Roz, who was already standing, already reaching for us, tears on her face, and she put her arms around both of us. Behind me, on the table, the silver bracelet and the christening blanket sat where he'd left them, a dead woman's name embroidered in the corner, waiting for a child who was never going to wear it. Warren followed us into the cold parking lot. Daniel took Violetta toward the car with Roz beside him, leaving me several steps from my father, but still within their sight. The certainty had gone from Warren's face and been replaced by something smaller and more desperate. "Agnes, please, wait." I stopped once, not because he had earned privacy or another chance, but because I wanted to hear what remained when the family was no longer gathered around him. He didn't apologize. I don't know why I still expected him to. He said, "I gave you everything of hers, everything. I kept her alive through you. Don't take that away from me. Don't take the baby too. She's all I have left of Madeline. Even then, even in an empty parking lot with his whole family stunned silent behind him, he could not see me. He was still asking me to be the door. I said, "That's the difference between us, Dad. Losing Mom was something that happened to you. I'm sorry it happened. I mean that. But what you did to me wasn't grief. Grief is a wound. What you did was a choice. You made it every single day for 27 years. You chose the ghost over your own child, every morning, on purpose. A wound you don't choose. This you did." His face crumpled into the old wounded expression that used to make me apologize. It did not work anymore. I reached into my coat pocket and took out the locket he had left on our coffee table. I had carried it that day on purpose. The same gold oval, my mother's picture pressed inside, that he had fastened around my 7-year-old neck so I would never forget whose face I carried. I placed it in his palm and closed his fingers around it. "I'm not the place you visit her anymore," I said, "and she never will be." I looked at Violetta. "Go home, Dad." For a moment, he stood there in the cold with the locket in his fist, and I saw him understand, maybe for the first time, that the ghost was all he was going to have. Then, quietly, almost to himself, he said the closest thing to truth I ever got from him. He said, "I don't know how to look at you and not see both of you." It was honest, and it was sad, and it had arrived decades too late to move me the way it once would have. Because a person can tell you the truth about the cage they built and still not open the door. He wasn't asking to change. He was asking to be forgiven for not changing. Those are not the same thing, and I had finally learned to tell them apart. I got in the car. I did not slam the door. I drove my daughter home. By March 2026, my father and I still did not speak. I had expected guilt to arrive in waves, but what came instead was grief for what I never had, relief that Violetta was protected, and occasional doubt that no longer controlled my decisions. His relatives did not respond as one group. A few called to apologize for judging me without asking what happened. Some said nothing. Others still described Warren as a grieving widower who meant well. I stopped trying to produce one shared verdict. His version was no longer the only version the family knew. Roz came over most Sundays. She held Violetta and told loud, unsaintly stories about the real Madeline, the woman who laughed too hard in restaurants, dyed her hair red out of spite, argued when she was angry, and wanted to see the world. My daughter would grow up knowing that her grandmother had been a person rather than a shrine. That felt like a more honest way to keep someone present. At 5 months old, Violetta was louder, heavier, and unmistakably herself. She had begun showing a temper and laughing at things none of us understood. Some days she resembled me, some days Daniel, and often no one but herself. One evening, Roz looked down at her in my arms and began, "Oh, she's got her—" Then she paused, recognized the old reflex, smiled, and said, "She's got her own eyes." The sentence did not erase the family habit of searching faces for the dead. It was simply a correction made in time. Violetta had her own eyes, in her own face, at the beginning of her own life. No one in our home would teach her that being loved required disappearing. Most Sundays, Daniel or I took one photograph of Violetta exactly as she was. Oatmeal in her hair, mid-shriek, asleep against Roz, or delighted by something only she could see. We printed some and placed them along one wall. It was not a gallery of a woman she was expected to become. It was an ordinary record of who she had been in each changing month. The difference was not the camera. It was whether the person in front of it was being observed or replaced. In February, I cut my hair short for the first time. I had wanted to do it since I was 12. When the last long section fell away, I did not become a new person or erase Madeline. I looked more like myself because I had finally chosen what that meant. It felt like stepping out of a costume I had forgotten I was allowed to remove. Roz told me that Warren remained in the house with the clocks, the unchanged answering machine message, and the nursery with Madeline painted above an empty crib. I did not go back to confirm it, and I could not know whether he would preserve the room forever. What I knew was that he had chosen the version of Madeline he could control over relationships with the daughter and granddaughter he could not. He had repeatedly made the living leave room for a ghost. He told relatives that I broke his heart when I carried Violetta out of the house, but that was not the night he lost me. He began losing me each time he withdrew love until I resembled Madeline again. Each time he treated my choices as damage to someone dead, and each time he looked through me for a person I could never become. I finally left when I understood that protecting my daughter required ending the role he had assigned to both of us. If you've spent your life being loved for a version of yourself that someone else built, praised when you matched it and left in the cold when the real you showed through, I want you to know that the quiet you carry is not proof that something is wrong with you. It may be evidence that you survived something other people could not see. If any of this reached somewhere real in you, tell me in the comments who taught you that being yourself was the mistake. I read them. You are not as alone in that silence as they made you feel.